What exactly is wrong with sailing culture? Because on the surface, sailing still looks almost impossible to criticize. It looks beautiful. It looks timeless. It looks elegant. It looks like freedom. It looks like one of the last real adventures left. A boat under sail still sells one of the strongest fantasies in the world. No roads, no noise, no crowds, just wind, water, skill, and independence. And that image is powerful for a reason. It makes sailing feel cleaner than the modern world, more honest than the modern world, more human than the modern world. But the deeper you look into the culture around sailing, the harder it becomes to ignore something uncomfortable. Because the ugly side of sailing is not just that it can be expensive, it is that the culture has spent years protecting the image while ignoring the system underneath it. And once you see that system clearly, a lot of things start making sense. Why sailing often feels exclusive. Why so many people feel unwelcome. Why so many outsiders see it as elitist. Why the industry keeps talking about growth while struggling to broaden who actually belongs. Why the sport loves talking about freedom, but so often ends up looking like status, hierarchy, and denial dressed up as tradition. That is the real problem. Sailing does not just have a few flaws, it has a culture problem. And the reason people avoid saying it out loud is because sailing has one of the most protective self-images of any niche in the world. It does not think of itself as just another hobby. It thinks of itself as something higher, a craft, a lifestyle, a discipline, a community, a way of seeing the world. And once a culture starts believing that strongly in its own moral beauty, it becomes very hard for it to admit when the reality stops matching the myth. That is exactly what has happened here. Because modern sailing culture still sells itself as open, adventurous, and deeply authentic, but in practice, it often operates like a closed social world shaped by wealth, exclusion, and image management. And the first reason is the most obvious one: money. Not a little money, a lot of money. Because sailing loves to talk about skill. It loves to talk about seamanship, experience, weather judgment, self-reliance, resilience. And all of that matters. But the truth is, access comes first. And access in sailing is still heavily controlled by wealth. That is not a side issue. That is the foundation. Because before someone gets to prove they love sailing, they usually have to get near it. They need access to lessons, to clubs, to boats, to marinas, to gear, to time, to transportation, to social networks that already understand how this world works. And all of that costs money. The data makes the pattern obvious. Boating participation rises sharply with income. Households earning over $200,000 participate at nearly 3 times the rate of households earning under $50,000. That tells you something important. Sailing is not just filtering people by interest, it is filtering them by class. And once you understand that, the rest of the culture becomes a lot easier to read. Because sailing does not just cost money once, it keeps costing money forever. Purchase, mooring, insurance, maintenance, storage, repairs, haul-outs, memberships, race entries, electronics, safety gear, unexpected failures. Even people who manage to buy in often discover that ownership is less a one-time leap and more a permanent financial drain. That matters because sailing still likes to describe itself as a world where passion matters most. But passion without access usually goes nowhere. And in sailing, access still belongs disproportionately to people who either have money, grew up around money, or are socially close to people who do. That is why the culture can feel closed even before anyone says a word. The dock says it, the club says it, the marina says it, the assumptions say it. You can feel when a place was built around the expectation that certain people will naturally fit there and others will need to adjust. And sailing has a lot of those spaces. This is where the image starts to crack. Because sailing likes to imagine itself as rugged and elemental, but much of the culture around it feels less like rugged freedom and more like polished exclusivity. That is why so many people outside the sailing world look at it and see status before they see seamanship. And the sailing world hates that reading, because status sounds shallow, it sounds unfair, it sounds unearned, it sounds like a betrayal of the whole romantic idea. But it is hard to avoid once you look honestly at how much of sailing culture is still shaped by private club dynamics, expensive entry points, inherited familiarity, and unspoken social codes. Even when the gates are not formally closed, the answer can still feel obvious. Technically open, socially selective. That difference matters more than sailing culture likes to admit, because inclusion is not just about whether someone is allowed to show up, it's about whether they can imagine a future there, and for a lot of people, that answer is still no. That becomes even clearer once you look at race. Sailing remains overwhelmingly white. About 82% of boaters are white. African American participation rates are dramatically lower. Minority participants often report feeling underrepresented in leadership and in the culture more broadly. And the problem is not simply current preference.
It is history, it is geography, it is club culture, it is access to waterfront spaces, it is mentorship, it is visibility. It is whether the sport feels like a world you were invited into or a world you are borrowing temporarily. That is a huge difference, because most people do not stay in communities where they constantly have to decode whether they are being welcomed or merely tolerated. And sailing often struggles with that. It struggles because the culture still tends to imagine the default sailor in a very specific way. White, affluent, older, already adjacent to the water, already familiar with the codes. Once that default becomes deeply embedded, everything else starts reinforcing it. Leadership looks similar, marketing looks similar, social networks look similar, mentorship flows through the same channels, authority stays concentrated in the same circles. That creates a loop. The culture looks homogeneous, so it feels homogeneous. It feels homogeneous, so fewer outsiders stay. Fewer outsiders stay, so leadership remains homogeneous. And then the whole system acts surprised that diversity keeps stalling. But this is not confusing, it is structural. The barriers are not just financial, they are cultural, informational, geographic, psychological. A lot of people never get shown a realistic path into sailing in the first place. Others do get near it, but the ownership process feels so complicated, expensive, and intimidating that they back away before they ever become part of the culture. Research on potential boaters shows exactly this. Many are interested, many are affluent enough to consider it, but they feel overwhelmed by the complexity. They do not understand the support market. They do not know financing options exist. They do not trust the emotional return on investment once they imagine the real cost and stress. That is important because it shows the problem is not just money, it is also mystification. Sailing keeps presenting itself as aspirational while doing a poor job of making itself legible. And when a culture is both expensive and confusing, it becomes very easy for it to preserve itself socially without ever having to say the quiet part out loud. That is one of the reasons community sailing programs matter so much. They lower the initial barrier. They shift the cost away from the individual. They create entry points that feel more human and less status-driven. But even those programs run into the same wall once people try to move deeper into traditional sailing culture. They can enter, they can learn, they can perform, they can belong for a while, but fitting in for a moment is not the same as sticking. And a lot of people do not stick because the surrounding culture still feels like it belongs to somebody else.
That brings us to gender, which is one of the clearest examples of how wide the gap is between sailing's self-image and its lived reality. Because sailing loves the story of the exceptional woman, the trailblazer, the skipper who breaks barriers, the all-female crew, the inspiring documentary, the symbolic victory, and those stories matter. But they can also hide something. They can make the culture look more solved than it actually is. Because underneath those visible moments, the day-to-day reality is still deeply unequal. The numbers are not subtle. 85% of women in the sailing industry report experiencing sexism. 65% of all respondents in the major equity review reported some form of discrimination. Women still face a large pay gap. Women still overwhelmingly believe gender balance remains a major unresolved problem. That is not a residue. That is a culture pattern. Women report walking onto boats and being assumed incompetent before they say a word, assumed less technical, less capable, less authoritative, less prepared. And that kind of assumption is incredibly corrosive, because it forces people to prove ordinary competence over and over again in situations where men are often granted it by default. That is exhausting. It changes behavior. It changes how people speak. It changes how much energy they spend managing the room instead of simply participating in the sport. Nearly 60% of women report adapting their behavior just to feel accepted. Think about what that really means. Not learning new skills, not becoming better sailors, not growing naturally into the culture, changing their personality to survive it. That is not inclusion. That is performance under pressure. And the sailing world has a bad habit of pretending that visible progress at the top automatically fixes the structure below. A bigger women's event, a famous skipper, a campaign, a panel, a documentary. Again, none of that is meaningless. The problem is when those things become substitutes for harder questions. What does the local club feel like? What happens when a woman gives instructions on deck? How often are assumptions made before evidence? How clear is reporting when something inappropriate happens? How many people quietly leave because the daily culture is more exhausting than rewarding? Those are the questions that reveal the truth. And the truth is that sailing still loses women at key life stages, late teens, early 20s, moments when identity and belonging matter most. That drop-off is not mysterious. People leave cultures that drain them, and if a sport keeps acting confused about why that happens while ignoring the actual environment people are describing, then the problem is not lack of awareness.
It is unwillingness to confront what awareness would force them to admit. Then there is the silence problem. This may be the ugliest part of all. Because sailing talks constantly about respect, integrity, seamanship, and responsibility. But when it comes to misconduct, abuse, harassment, and power imbalance, many people in the sport still do not know where to report things, do not trust the process, or assume speaking up will damage their own future. That is devastating. A huge share of participants are aware of violence, abuse, or harmful conduct in their sailing communities. Almost half are not even aware of proper reporting structures. That tells you everything. The problem is not just bad behavior, it is weak institutions. Because when people do not know where to go or do not believe the system will protect them, formal values stop meaning much. And nowhere is that clearer than in professional crew culture, especially on superyachts. This is where the fantasy of sailing becomes almost impossible to defend honestly. Because superyachts are sold as the pinnacle of maritime life. Beauty, craftsmanship, luxury, adventure with no compromise. But for many crew members, the reality is something else entirely. Extreme hierarchy, long hours, sleep disruption, small windowless cabins, dependence on owners and senior officers for employment, housing, food, medical care, and future references. And in too many cases, abuse. Crew can work up to 20 hours a day during charter. Rest hours are often underreported or manipulated to preserve technical compliance. 40% report unwanted contact. Only a small share of victims file complaints. Women are far more likely to report abuse, bullying, discrimination, harassment, and violence. That is not a side issue in the luxury end of the industry. That is a labor crisis.
And the reason it persists is not complicated. Power. When your workplace is also your housing, your food, your reputation, and your next job reference, it becomes extremely dangerous to challenge the wrong person. That makes silence rational, not because nothing is wrong, because the cost of telling the truth can be enormous. This is why the superyacht world often feels less like glamorous sailing and more like old-class hierarchy with better branding. Guests above, crew below. Wealth on display, service rendered invisibly. Luxury on the surface, exhaustion underneath. And the sailing world does not like discussing that because it destroys the image. But the image is not the point if the system underneath is rotten. Then we get to one of the biggest contradictions in the whole culture, the environmental myth. Sailing benefits from one of the strongest moral assumptions of any activity on the water. Sails mean wind. Wind means low fuel use. Low fuel use means clean. Clean means ethical. Simple, comforting, and deeply incomplete, because the environmental footprint of sailing is far messier than the image suggests. Start with old fiberglass boats. Fiberglass changed boating. It made production easier, it expanded ownership, it helped build the modern recreational fleet. But it also created a long-term disposal disaster. Fiberglass is notoriously difficult to recycle. It has almost no scrap value. Proper disposal is expensive, often more than $24,000 per boat. So what happens when old fiberglass boats die? Too often, they do not get disposed of properly. They get neglected, stripped, abandoned, quietly dumped, and then they become ghost boats. Derelict vessels decaying in waterways and sensitive ecosystems, releasing a toxic mix of pollutants as they break down: lead, mercury, cadmium, hydrocarbons, asbestos, PCBs, fiberglass particles, microplastics. These are not harmless leftovers. They damage coral, mangroves, seagrass, sediment health, and local ecosystems. They create major public cleanup costs. Washington and Oregon have spent over $21 million removing and destroying abandoned vessels. Recovered derelict boats in Puget Sound have surged as aging fiberglass fleets reach the end of life. That is not a small problem. That is a structural waste crisis. And it directly contradicts the self-image of sailing as a culture of stewardship, because a community that truly respected the sea would not normalize a system where huge numbers of dead boats have no responsible end-of-life pathway. That is not stewardship, that is outsourced neglect. Then there is anti-fouling paint, which sounds technical and boring until you realize it captures the whole ethical contradiction in one topic. Boats need protection from biofouling. If marine growth builds up on the hull, drag increases, fuel use rises, performance drops, and the whole system becomes less efficient. So the industry relies on anti-fouling coatings. The trouble is what those coatings do. Tributyltin, one of the most harmful substances ever knowingly introduced into the marine environment, caused severe ecological damage before it was banned. Then the industry shifted heavily toward copper-based paints. Copper works, but copper ions are highly toxic to plankton and damaging to enclosed marine environments like marinas and harbors. They accumulate in sediments. They reduce species diversity. They impair reproduction, feeding, growth, and key biological functions in aquatic life. So the same culture that loves to talk about harmony with the sea often depends on toxic coatings that quietly poison local ecosystems. That is the paradox.
The clean image of sailing depends on leaving out a lot of the technical reality, and the luxury end of the sector makes that contradiction even worse, because the superyacht world blows apart the green halo entirely. A single billionaire's superyacht can emit around 5,672 tons of carbon per year. That is more than 700 times the footprint of the average European. Roman Abramovich's yachts alone were estimated at around 22,000 tons. At that point, calling this lifestyle nautical adventure starts sounding absurd. This is not seamanship, it is carbon aristocracy. Floating mansions, diesel power, air conditioning, heated pools, massive service infrastructure, extreme luxury consumption hidden behind maritime aesthetics. And what makes it even uglier is that these vessels often sit outside the kinds of regulatory pressure ordinary people are expected to accept elsewhere. The sailing world still borrows moral credibility from wind, nature, and tradition, but that credibility collapses the moment you include the billionaire yacht world honestly. Then there is another uncomfortable subject that cuts straight into one of sailing's deepest myths: self-reliance. Sailing loves the image of the prepared mariner, the capable voyager, the person who takes on risk with competence and discipline. And sometimes that image is deserved. But modern sailing also contains a less flattering reality. A lot of people are underprepared. And when underprepared sailors push too far, the burden of that decision does not disappear into the romance of adventure. It lands on search and rescue services, on taxpayers, on commercial vessels, on community responders, on state agencies, on other people. This is a difficult topic because the right to be rescued at sea is fundamental. Human life matters.
people should be saved. That is not the question. The question is whether modern sailing culture sometimes encourages fantasies of capability that are not matched by actual preparation. And the answer is yes. Modern distress technology saves lives. EPIRBs, GPS, satellite communication, emergency beacons, these are incredible tools. But they also change psychology. They can make the sea feel more manageable than it really is. They can tempt people into voyages they are not ready for. They can soften the perceived consequences of poor planning. When that happens, the rescue burden becomes real. Major ocean rescues can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Commercial ships get diverted from their routes. Community responders burn out. In some regions, merchant vessels have become rescue actors in situations they were never designed to handle. So once again, the contradiction appears. Sailing celebrates boldness. It celebrates passage-making. It celebrates freedom. But it does not always confront the competence gap honestly enough. And when that gap leads to emergency, the cost gets pushed outward. That is not just bad luck. That is an ethics problem. Because freedom without preparation is not noble. It is outsourced risk. And sailing culture can be strangely bad at saying that clearly, partly because adventure stories sell, and partly because the mythology of sailing depends on keeping danger emotionally attractive. Then there's leadership. This is one of the clearest tests of whether a culture is serious about change. Who holds authority? Who makes decisions? Who gets visibility? Who gets to define what counts as normal? Who gets protected when conflict happens? Large numbers of women and minority participants do not feel represented in leadership. That matters enormously. Because leadership is not just symbolic, it shapes rules, funding, discipline, hiring, culture, standards, what gets measured, what gets ignored. And sailing still struggles with this. Institutions have launched frameworks. World sailing has equity targets. U.S. sailing has DEI pillars. There are commitments around recruitment, retention, inclusion, community engagement, messaging, and zero-tolerance codes. That is not meaningless, but policy language is the easy part. Culture change is harder. A target does not automatically create trust. A statement does not automatically create belonging. A code of conduct does not automatically make people feel safe reporting abuse. A campaign does not automatically make a club welcoming. That is the danger. A culture can learn the right words without changing the underlying power. And sailing is especially vulnerable to that because it already knows how to look meaningful. It knows how to use the language of stewardship, tradition, integrity, and community. It knows how to tell stories that feel noble. It knows how to make the whole world look morally elevated simply by putting it against blue water and white sails. That beauty is part of the problem, because beauty can become cover. It can make people softer on exclusion, softer on class hierarchy, softer on sexism, softer on labor abuse, softer on environmental negligence. A sunset from the cockpit does not erase a pay gap. A varnished tiller does not erase harassment. A clean wake under sail does not erase toxic coatings. A beautiful marina does not erase racial homogeneity. A superyacht tender does not erase what happens below deck. And sailing culture needs to hear that more clearly, because the longer it keeps defending the fantasy first, the harder the correction becomes. That is what ties all of this together. The ugly side of sailing is not a random list of separate issues. It is one repeating pattern. Sailing solves the image problem first. It solves how the lifestyle looks, how it feels, how it is marketed, how it is remembered, how it appears to outsiders. But it does not solve the structural problems underneath with the same urgency. That pattern is everywhere. It is there in the wealth barrier. Aspirational image on top, financial enclosure underneath. It is there in race. Open water mythology on top, inherited sameness underneath. It is there in gender, celebrated pioneers on top, daily competence bias underneath. It is there in abuse, codes and values on top, silence and fear underneath. It is there in superyachts, luxury and craftsmanship on top, labor exploitation underneath. It is there in environmental messaging, wind-powered purity on top, fiberglass waste and carbon excess underneath. It is there in adventure culture, romance on top, externalized rescue burden underneath. That is why the culture feels off to so many people, even when they cannot fully explain why. They can sense the mismatch. They can feel that the moral branding and the lived reality do not line up. And when a culture becomes too dependent on image management, that mismatch eventually turns into a credibility problem. That matters because credibility is not optional anymore. Sailing wants younger people. It wants more diversity. It wants growth. It wants relevance. It wants legitimacy in a world that is becoming more sensitive to labor ethics, environmental cost, and social exclusion. But you cannot build that future honestly on top of denial. You cannot keep saying sailing is freedom while offering a culture that feels closed. You cannot keep saying sailing is ethical while ignoring toxic disposal and billionaire emissions. You cannot keep saying sailing is a meritocracy while access is still heavily shaped by wealth and inherited familiarity. You cannot keep saying sailing is community while too many people feel outside, below deck, or afraid to speak. Eventually, people stop buying the story. And when they stop buying the story, the danger is not just criticism, it is irrelevance. Because if the culture remains too expensive, too homogeneous, too defensive, and too dependent on beauty to excuse its contradictions, people will not just critique it, they will bypass it. They will take the parts of sailing they love and leave the old culture behind. They will learn outside traditional institutions. They will build alternative communities. They will reject the old status codes. They will be less patient with environmental hypocrisy, less tolerant of abuse, less impressed by prestige. That may already be happening, which means sailing culture is at a fork in the road. It can do what many old niche cultures do when pressure arrives.
Get defensive, get nostalgic, insist outsiders do not understand. Point to the beauty, point to the tradition, point to a few success stories and pretend the system is basically fine. Or it can do something much harder. It can admit that the ugly side is not an attack on sailing, it is a warning. A warning that a culture built around beauty, access, and status can drift very far from the values it claims to represent unless it actively fights that drift. Real reform would mean lowering the entry barrier for real, not just talking about inclusion in brochures. It would mean moving from representation as optics to belonging as something measurable. It would mean clear reporting systems, third-party protections, and real consequences for abuse. It would mean treating crew welfare as central, not peripheral. It would mean building serious end-of-life systems for fiberglass boats instead of pushing disposal costs onto the public and the environment. It would mean confronting the emissions hypocrisy at the top of the luxury sector instead of hiding behind the green aura of sailing. It would mean being more honest about competence, preparation, and the real cost of adventure. It would mean asking whether clubs are actually welcoming or merely technically accessible. In other words, it would mean building the culture around substance instead of image. And that is hard, because image is easy. Image is profitable. Image is seductive. Substance is slower, messier, less glamorous, much more threatening to the people who benefit from the current structure. But substance is the only thing that can save sailing culture long term. That is why this conversation matters.